listening to The Tabletop Minimalist, a podcast about minimalism and thoughtful consumerism in the modern tabletop gaming hobby. Settle in and enjoy. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of The Tabletop Minimalist. I'm Ricky and I'm here with Jamie. How are you doing, Jamie?
Not too bad. Great to be with you, Ricky.
Good stuff. So for today, we've got a lot to talk about in terms of our main topic, but we're going to start off talking about just some recent plays. And Jamie, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So I think considering we are the Tabletop Minimalist podcast, we want to keep this section short and tight. So I think each of us will just talk about one highlight play and then maybe one game we're calling and then move right into the main body of the podcast. So recently, I would say for sure in the month of March, my highlight without a doubt has been my all-time, I think I mentioned this in the first episode, my all-time favorite game is called Codex. And one of my big gaming goals, if you will, in the year 2025 was to find a regular gaming partner for this game.
Yeah.
I hadn't played the game in probably over a year or two. And I really felt that I really wanted to remedy that going into 2025. So fortunately, one of the beauties of Board Game Geek is that almost every single game has its super fans. So if you are bold enough to do some outreach, quite often you'll be lucky enough to find someone who's willing to jump through some loops to get a game played. So I did such a thing and found someone who loves Codex as much as I do. So for the past few weeks, we've basically been playing nonstop Codex on Screentop, which is a platform, one of those platforms similar to Tabletop Simulator or something like that. So that's just been awesome. So I feel like I've been in gaming bliss the entire month of March.
That's cool, yeah. I wondered actually when you first mentioned Codex, like how often you were able to play it in terms of having a regular partner. So yeah, that's really cool.
What about you, Ricky? What have you been enjoying lately in gaming?
So I've not had much time for gaming the past 3 to 4 weeks, which is when since we last recorded. But one game I have got to the table, at least physically. I've had a few other games on Board Game Arena, but the one that I got to the table physically that I particularly enjoyed is Lacrimosa, and this is a game by Gerard Asensi and Ferran Renalius. I probably butchered those, but apologies. This is pretty much a bog standard Euro, but what drew me into it was the theme, which is basically you're retelling the life of Mozart and you're finishing his final piece, the Requiem. So there's a lot of sort of intermingling mechanisms here. There's a bit of area control. There's sort of doing contract fulfillment. There's a bit of deck building almost, or I'd call it deck tweaking because you're actually sort of losing. You're not actually adding cards to your deck. You're swapping cards to your deck. But the theme, I find the theme really cool. And although it is, you could say it's sort of pasted on, it certainly helped to get it to the table because I don't think I would have done if it was just a sort of standard, trading in the Mediterranean game.
For sure.
But no, it's been good. I've had 4 games now, so I actually got a game in yesterday as well, and I'm starting to enjoy it more and more. So we'll see how much the longevity is. There seems to be a fair bit of replayability in there. We'll see how long it stays positive in my eyes. But yeah, that's been a highlight for me.
That's awesome, and I think it does go to show, and we'll touch on this in today's episode, how a theme might not directly impact replayability, but it certainly helps get a game to the table more often.
Absolutely, yeah. It can certainly help with when you're looking at playing a game and something catches your eye.
So the second part of this segment is considering we mentioned in our first episode, we were talking about, let's just say, I think Ricky and I both share the philosophy of maintaining a small collection, but also still exploring and discovering the games that are out there. So always having maybe a small proportion of our games going through a bit of a churn. So we thought that some of the listeners might find it interesting to hear what games are we bringing in or what games are we calling. And I have a few games that I'm calling right now, but I would say the one highlight and probably the biggest surprise to those who have followed my geek list or list in the past is Tashkalar.
I saw this actually on the show notes, and after seeing some of your geek lists and just talking to you about it, it came as a bit of a surprise to me.
Yeah, so I discovered Tashkalar, I want to say about 2 years ago. I first tested it out on BGA several times to be sure that it would be a game worth buying. And those plays on BGA, I just found that I really loved the game. I really enjoyed the puzzle of trying to figure out the patterns and trying to achieve the objectives at the same time. So probably over a period of several months, I must have played the game 50, 60, 70 times. I was just super hooked on it, really enjoying the game. And I also felt like I was getting better at the game.
Yeah.
And then I think over the past year, just with my young twins, just kind of put it on the back burner for a while. So I hadn't played the game, I want to say, in maybe a year, especially at a higher, more competitive level on BGA. And I had not one, but two. I had two back-to-back really abysmal plays of the game. And it was, sure, maybe to some degree it was being rusty and perhaps even my poor play. But I couldn't help but shake this feeling that I had an experience with the game that I'd never had before, which is kind of hitting this point of cascading failure where even with Tashkalar's built-in catch-up mechanism, which are these type of cards called flares, I just felt like I had no chance of getting back into the game.
Yeah.
So it was strange. I think sometimes what happens with games is you have that initial honeymoon period where you just can't get enough of it. There's nothing wrong with it. And then maybe it just takes a certain situation or scenario where you start seeing the flaws and warts in a game.
Yeah.
And I think especially now as I've been trying to prune more and more just okay average games out of my collection, I just found that, I think I enjoyed my experience with this game, but I just felt like these two really bad plays just kind of damaged my feelings for the game, and I felt okay with moving it to the sell shelf.
I'm curious, when you played it, because I know you said you played it for, up to 70 games, was there any sort of hint of those things kind of happening in those 70 plays, or did it come as a surprise to you with these two recent ones?
That's what's so surprising about it, is that in all the times that I played the game, I never had plays go like this, where I felt like I was so out of the game. So just uncompetitive and just out even by early mid game.
Yeah.
So that was what was such a surprise, and I didn't feel like it was necessarily due completely to poor play either. So I don't know. It was just like these two anomalies, if you will.
Yeah.
And this could very well be me. This could be arbitrary. This could be subjective. There might be a veteran Tashkalar players out there who say, "Oh, you probably just were playing poorly." Fair enough. But it was enough that it just kind of killed my interest in the game.
Yeah, I understand that. Especially when you've not played it for a while and then you bring it back and then you have a couple of bad plays. That's enough for it to kind of, be on its way out. I understand that. For me, this is a game that, to be honest, I've been meaning to get rid of for a while and I just haven't got round to it. But it's Mission Red Planet by Bruno Catala and Bruno Feduti. This is one that I played a few times with higher player counts, but it's quite hard for me to get those numbers of players to the table. I think it's best with 4+, and my general gaming play count is 2 to 3 normally, and it's certainly not a 2-player game at all. Very briefly, it's just a game. It's kind of a chaotic game where you're sending astronauts to Mars and you're kind of trying to blow each other's spaceships up. It's area majority. You got trying to basically fill secret objectives. It's quite fun, but it's not one that A, I will manage to play very often, and B, if I do have the higher player counts, I think I'd rather jump and play another game anyway. So it's just one that has been sitting there for a couple of months and I've been meaning to just get rid of, and I think now is the time.
Yeah, and I think similar to a previous example we just mentioned, I think player count is also one of those factors that can play into a game's replayability, as some games really just, it's as a point of fact, they shine at a certain player count. And if you can't get that player count, the game just won't be the same experience.
Absolutely. And I think we'll discuss this a bit more, but often you do have to sort of create your collection based on the players that you're able to play with as well. Some games just aren't going to be viable for you.
So I think without further ado, that's good enough for this segment. Let's get right into the main body of today's podcast.
So today is quite a big topic. I think there's a lot to discuss. We're discussing what makes a game stand the test of time, and I think this ties in very much to our philosophy in terms of choosing games that stay on our shelf, that, you know, hopefully fit our minimalism philosophy and are games that we want to play for years to come. And we're going to discuss, you know, all the design elements that help keep games fresh and some of the different aspects that can contribute to that. And I think there's a lot of crossover, at least when I was going through making some points myself, I realized how much different elements sort of tie into one another. But there's a lot to discuss here. So I guess, yeah, Jamie, why don't you start us off in terms of just sort of defining what our definition of what are the key things of sort of replayability that you think are important to discuss?
Okay, so yes, just a very quick caveat or disclaimer is I would probably say neither of us are game theory experts.
No.
But both of us did the best we could, I think, to do enough research to I would say to stay within our wheelhouse. And if you have any questions or, you know, if you think we missed something, feel free to let us know in the comments for today's episode. So yes, in terms of replayability, why is replayability important to us? Because as we mentioned in our first episode, if you're keeping a smaller, leaner collection, ideally you want every single game in your small collection to deliver, to be able to play, you know, to be enjoyable for a very long period of time. So based on, I would say, some of our own brainstorming, we fell upon, I would suppose, some of the following ideas. Strategic depth. And in a moment, I'll define what Ricky and I believe to be strategic depth when it comes to games. Player interaction, skill expression, as you're getting better at the game, can you effectively show off and demonstrate your skills at the game? Asymmetry, as I'll put it, content mass. In other words, is there a lot of content in the game in terms of cards, campaigns, factions, and so on, just to name a few. The difficulty in the entire learning process of the game. The meta of this game, and we'll touch on that. And perhaps even a little randomness. The idea is, for example, poker is there's a lot of randomness in poker, and yet people are playing that game as a lifestyle game. So before we dive into all these different concepts, I think it's important that Ricky and I define what we think of, or let's just say our working definition of what we think strategic depth is. Ricky, do you want to go through kind of the formula, if you will?
Yeah, so I think strategic depth, a few points that we made. I think, first of all, there's got to be balanced path to victory. So there's got to be multiple strategies that you can take that are all viable and they offer different approaches to winning. And I also think there needs to be a lot of meaningful choices. So players, you know, that are regularly faced with significant decisions that affect their outcome and their strategic direction. So a lot of choices for you to ponder and to determine which way your game is going to head. I also think that there needs to be a complex decision tree. So there needs to be decisions that you make that then branch out into a web of future consequences according to what you chose to do, which allows for planning and also adaptability as that plays out. I think there needs to be some rules of thumb with exceptions. So players can form strategic heuristics, but exceptions create space for nuanced, evolving mastery. And then finally, player interaction and counterplay. So you must be able to adapt your strategies to opponent's moves, which allows for dynamic gameplay and also deeper decision making as you sort of try to battle against your opponent towards victory.
Absolutely. And regarding that last one, I think it's good to note is that because in recent years, I think it's become more and more common to see let's just say multiplayer solitaire style of games where really every player in the game is swimming in their own lane. And yet I still think even in those type of games, for example, just to cite an example like Terraforming Mars, where there might be some subtle ways to directly interact with your opponents, but really what it is like you're racing to certain milestones, you're racing to different scoring opportunities. So you still, even in a game like that where it's not take that or mean, so to speak, you still need to be paying attention, countering, and thinking about what to do to thwart what your opponents are doing.
Absolutely.
So, Ricky, thank you for laying out that definition. I think for at least the time being, that covers a lot about what we think of depth. So why don't we touch on first the difference or the distinction between replayability and variability? Because I do think sometimes that gamers and people will mix let's just say they almost treat them as the same thing. So what do you think are the differences, Ricky?
Well, I think replayability, well, first of all, I think that both of them are different things, because I think variability is kind of a surface type thing. You know, it changes surface elements such as setup, the factions, the modules you're playing with, and it's very factual. It's like, okay, this is varied. But replayability is whether the game is actually engaging over time, you know, whether it has strategic depth, skill expression, tension, all of those types of things. So they're not necessarily both the same thing. And a game can have one without the other. For example, chess and Go have extremely high replayability, but zero variability. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got Kickstarter games that have super high variability a lot of the time with all the modules, but often they can have low replayability. And then there's some games that are sort of strong in both.
At the very least, we have an idea of what the spectrum looks like. So, as you said, you know, chess and Go have static setups, but they're practically they're endlessly replayable due to their depth. And as we mentioned, maybe some of these Kickstarter games, there might be a lot of different setup differences or campaigns or factions or whatever, but maybe if there's not a lot of meaningful choices, the gameplay can still feel shallow. Mm-hmm. And then there are some games that have deep strategic decisions, but maybe the way the cards come out is different each one, so it makes the game feel fresh.
Yeah.
All right, so let's dive right into the first one, which is player interaction. So do social elements like negotiation, deception, teamwork keep a game fresh longer, or do we feel that a game that's higher in player interaction, whether it be positive or negative, does that help with the longevity of a game?
For me, I think games like that have deduction. There's loads of party games that have this, you know, in very high doses. But even with games that just have smaller elements of this, I really enjoy the games that give me this type of feeling, because it feels like I'm juggling two challenges at once, you know, mastering the mechanics on one hand, and on the other hand, you know, outthinking the players. So, you know, like I said, it obviously, if you're playing a party game, like let's just say Werewolf or, you know, Deception, Murder in Hong Kong, that's the entire game. You're playing the players around the table, but it can also enrich gameplay far beyond, you know, that of a standard Euro. And there are two games that I really like that have this a lot of social interaction, Carnegie and Keyflower. Both games are, you know, it feels like you're playing two separate games, and it's really interesting because your moves really, they feel like they matter more because you're really keeping an eye on the other player. And, you know, even a simple rule set can have deep staying power when you're balancing both the mechanics and the human behavior.
Absolutely. I think even in a game with low variability, high player interaction can really create interesting game states every game. You're not just playing the game, you're also playing the players.
Yeah.
So the game might be somewhat predictable or not as variable, but for example, the way a person plays the game can differ dramatically. So, and especially if that group of players that you're playing with varies from game to game, then the entire feel of the game might be different. So that alone can really, I think, affect the replayability of a game. So nowadays for me, player interaction is one of the main features I seek out in a game. Like if I look at almost every game on my shelf, I think you can point out some form of player interaction in that game. For me, multiplayer solitaire kills a game for me because it feels like kind of like a glorified Mensa test where the higher IQ individual will always win out. And there's no way for me or other players to influence or to disrupt those plans. Whereas if a game has that player interaction, then I feel like the players have more agency to kind of stay competitive and stay in the game.
In an ideal world, I completely agree with you. I need to be cognizant of the type of, or the players that I'm able to play with regularly. And some of those players aren't as high into the, well, they don't mind interaction, but we're talking about if it's super mean interaction, that can be a bit of a risky area. So I'm still always looking for games that have good interaction, but interaction that hopefully can cater to different styles of players. Because I think group chemistry can massively impact replayability. Certain games will sing with certain groups and fall flat with others, and I've had this experience quite heavily in some games, particularly as I said, party games or party leaning games like Cosmic Encounter and Dead of Winter, both games that I was hoping my group would really enjoy, and both actually fell really flat. And if I played with another group, I reckon I would have kept both of those games. Both those games have left my collection now, but I reckon I would have kept them. It was based on the response of my group.
Yeah, no, I completely can understand, especially the level of sensitivity to quote unquote mean games. For example, probably my number 2 game of all time right now is called Argent the Consortium. And I'll be flat, this might be one of the top 5, top 3 meanest Euros out there. I just love it for it because it does give you some mitigation and agency on how to deal with being attacked. And fortunately, everyone that I've introduced that to has enjoyed it. So
that's good.
So that's nice. But yes, interaction is very much, it varies from, that's very, very much a matter of taste.
Yeah.
So the next area to explore here is asymmetry. So to asymmetric games such as Root, Cosmic Encounter, Spirit Island, do they have more staying power because of this variety of the factions, characters, so on?
So yeah, I mean, I know I just mentioned Cosmic Encounter from a personal experience, but I do think it is extremely replayable due to the amount of aliens you get in there. So you've got a ton of asymmetric player powers to play with there. I think it differs to something like Root, because I think that Cosmic Encounter is more about discovery and enjoying different aliens. I mean, I'm sure there's groups out there that really know the aliens they play with and really sort of clued up on how to game each player power that they have. But I think for a lot of people it leans more on that sort of casual, lighter side where it's just fun to explore these different powers and mess around, and it's less about mastery and more about discovery. But even so, that is still a type of replayability.
Exactly. I know for sure in the past, Spirit Island was one of my favorite games. I know in the Punchboard Paradise group that Richie is, I think his favorite game is Spirit Island. I think just a big part of what makes that game so amazing, I think, for a lot of people is just you don't have to play every single spirit. You might find a spirit that you just love playing.
Yeah.
And you can play it over and over and over again if you so wish. Or you can get a lot of satisfaction and joy from just trying out all the different spirits in the game. Like
you say, it can be both. It can be discovering, playing the new spirits, but I think there's more scope there to master a spirit and really sort of understand how to play one. Compared to something like Cosmic Encounter, where it's more about quantity and discovery.
I believe asymmetric games or games with asymmetry are naturally, inherently more replayable because each faction, character, race, whatever you call it, feels like a unique mini game that you can learn, explore, practice, and master. So obviously this is depending on, let's just say, the strategic depth of the game. So this can range from very mild asymmetry, maybe each player just has a very simple, a one-sentence player power, to wildly different characters, like, as we just mentioned, the spirits in Spirit Island, the factions in Root, and so on, or maybe a character class in a dungeon crawl. So it can, obviously, this level of asymmetry can really differ.
Yeah.
Not to mention, I think you can build an affinity for certain characters or play styles in a game. So, for example, in Codex, it has 6 different decks or factions that you can play, and they definitely derive from some of like the classic colors in Magic. For example, aggro, growth, control. So I found for sure I really enjoy playing the aggressive deck, the aggro deck.
Codex is an interesting one because it's a game that I almost picked up 4 or 5 years ago, and I never did. I was really looking into it. And I guess and it's because you buy it in the starter sets, you get 2 factions per starter set. And at first glance, that might not seem like there's much gameplay there, much replayability there. But actually, from hearing from you and from hearing from others, that you can actually get a ton just from that base set.
So I think you're referring to the core set, which is like red and green.
The core set, yeah.
Right.
That's it, yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So I think just a little bit later in the episode, I'll be touching on this. Okay. I specifically cited this as an example. So we'll follow up on that.
All right, yeah, sounds good.
Let's continue into the next one, which is emergent gameplay. So how do games allow for unexpected interactions between the mechanics and players as the game progresses from early game to mid game to end game?
Yeah, so again, I mean, this is sort of touching on what I just mentioned about codex, and I'm sure, again, this will come up later. A lot of these points do blend into one another, but I think that there's such a focus on variability these days, because I think variability is the way to immediately sell to someone that there's replayability, you know, whether there is or not. You can be like, look, there's X amount of factions, there's X amount of different games setups and modules and things. But because of this, I think often a game can seem not that replayable at first, but actually provides a ton of emergent gameplay and strategy the more you play. And an example for me was Gugong, which is a game by Andreas Stedding. And I remember before I picked this up, well, it was actually after I picked it up. This is one of those games that I just went for as well. Should have done a bit more research, but luckily it played out in my favor, because a lot of the comments I saw afterwards, they were saying, oh, there's not much replayability, there's not much variability. But there doesn't need to be, because I've found the emergent gameplay and the strategy that comes out as you play, and as you realize how there's 7 mini games on the board, how they interact with each other, is just so, it just creates so much depth and so much replayability, just in terms of trying to figure out how to game all these systems. You know, they're not separate systems, they all interlink together, and the way that the board state is set up each game, the way that it differs as the game plays with the different players. No two game is going to be the same, even if it is set up exactly the same as the last time you played. So the emergent gameplay there, and the realization of how all these systems interlink and how you can sort of take advantage of them, I find is really, really great in that game. And I think a lot of games follow that sort of follow that trend as well.
Well, especially with emerging game, complex gameplay, I think games like Go is a perfect example, because all you're doing is putting stones on a grid board, and initially it just starts with 1 or 2 stones, and then very quickly the complexity emerges, it just explodes.
Absolutely.
Even games like that. Yes, indeed. I think for a lot of games that have a lot of these meaningful choices and viable competitive game states and options, this can definitely play a factor. One thing I just want to touch here, because you mentioned this idea of also rewarding skill growth in a game that makes you feel like you're learning something new every game, especially maybe for the first few plays.
Yeah.
Or, for example, in the instance of Codex, where I played maybe 10, 20 times, I still feel like I'm not even close to learning everything that's involved. There's this great video on YouTube. I recommend listeners go check it out, by David Serlin. His channel is called Serlin on Design. So in this channel, he covers a lot of topics on game design and design theory and whatnot. And he has this great video on depth, talking about depth in games and dispelling a lot of misconceptions and myths about what people think depth are. And in it, he mentions this idea of the depth fallacy, which is the idea that if a game is hard to understand, has lots of complicated rules, or you learn or just something or discover something every time you play, then it must be deep, which he says is not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
I'll be honest that I don't think I quite understand game theory enough to go further than that. So I just encourage you to go check out the video and hear his argument and see if you find it compelling or not.
Yeah, I'll have to watch that.
Yeah, I do find it worth a listen. So the next one is just, and I think following this, so we were talking about this skill growth, which is how difficult, let's just say the learning process, how difficult it is to learn how difficult it is just to reach a level of, let's just say, sound play or proficient play. So this is the idea of maybe not being able to get everything done in the game, trying to master a game or overcome a difficult encounter in a co-op game. So for me, I think like many things, the pursuit of improvement and mastery is one of the main objectives that brings anyone back to a game. I think this is why games of leveling up, that where you get points, things like that, why they're so addicting and so satisfying and fun to play, is that you have that sense of progression, of improvement. And that's what brings us back. And I think for any endeavor of significance for that matter. So although I think an important caveat here is that the game has enough strategic depth to be worth delving to in the first place. I don't think you see too many people trying to spend too much time to master tic-tac-toe.
Yeah, definitely not, no. And building on that, I think that certain games, I mean, again, for me, this is a massive factor in terms of how replayable a game is. But certain games certainly entice me with this over others. And I think that all my favorite games are ones that I really want to explore deeply and master, not just because that I enjoy them, but because I think the games that I gravitate towards are games where there is, you can visualize there is scope to improve your strategy or to explore it further. Like I said before, I think games with a lot of variability can sometimes feel like there's too much going on, and it's hard to sort of plan how you will do better next time. Whereas a game that has where you can sort of see where you're heading and where you can maybe improve, they're the games that I really particularly enjoy.
Yeah, I think for me, that's why we mentioned this in the first episode, where we both feel like we fall on the side in terms of the spectrum between collectors and gamers, on the side of gamers, because yes. I think for me, and that's why I enjoy so much the process of exploring and delving into a game, is just because you get to enjoy that sense of progression, of improvement. Whereas if you're just playing a game once or twice and then moving on, you're always kind of stuck in that learner phase.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
So the next one is this idea of theme versus mechanics, or let's just say the impact of theme on replayability. What do you think about theme, Ricky?
So I think this is quite a quick section for me personally, because I think theme's nice. I think it can attract you to a game. Like I said, it attracted me to Lacrimosa. That being a sort of standard Euro game wouldn't have really interested me if it was, say, trading in the Mediterranean or whatever. But because it had this interesting theme, I was drawn to it. However, I don't think it correlates to replayability. It might, again, make it exciting to play the first time as you explore it. But in terms of when you're sort of trying to get a grasp of the mechanisms and everything, that's what supersedes theme. I think that's what keeps you coming back after you've first got into a game.
I agree for the most part. I don't think I have too much to add, although I might say that if you like the theme or the setting of a game, it certainly doesn't hurt getting it back to the table, because you want to return to that.
Absolutely not.
You want to return to that world.
I think, I think theme can be a nice short-term factor of replayability. When you're getting into the 20, 30 plays, and that's when I think it really has to be a strong, well-made game in terms of mechanisms to keep you coming back.
Absolutely. So part of me wonder, this next section is, we're talking about the relationship between solvability and longevity. So again, I'm just going to, disclaimer, I did some research on this, looking at some articles and videos. I'm going to do my best to stay within my wheelhouse and understanding of game theory. But if you think about it, the one thing you'll, especially if you watch board game YouTubers, influencers, so on, they'll say it ran its path. It ran its way out. The runway for this game was only so many plays where I felt like I'd seen everything I needed to see, on to the next. And that's this idea of, from the design perspective, it's a constant battle against solvability, or for the gamers feeling like they've either solved the game or they've seen everything there's to be seen in the game, which is kind of the death knell for any game in terms of replayability. So can a game lose its appeal once the optimal or dominant strategy is discovered? Which I think the answer to that is self-evident. And I'm just going to touch on this a little bit, which is that this idea between what's called, let's say, a pure solution and a mixed solution. So a pure solution refers to, for example, perfect information games where everything's out there on the table. There's no randomness. So Go, chess, I believe Puerto Rico is a perfect information game. Hence why there's such a meta around where you sit, how you play, and so on. So a pure solution just essentially is just a set of instructions that tell you exactly how you should play. So memorization, whereas you essentially just memorize a certain sequence of instructions and that'll tell you exactly how you should play and you should win if you do so.
Yeah.
Whereas there's what's called a mixed solution or a mixed strategy is a set of strategies where you assign a probability to each one. So your instructions in this case might be like, okay, if the opponent does X, I'll do Y. But maybe it's more like, okay, if the opponent does X, I'll do Y 30% of the time and Z 70% of the time. So in a certain mixed solution, if there's an optimal way to play, then we'll call that a mixed solution, depending on the circumstances. So according to David Serlin, for example, if a game is deep enough and utilizes a mixed solution, then this will delay people being able to solve the game for a very long time. And as he believes that the ideal, one of the best ways to prevent or delay solvability is to inject either randomness or some hidden information or some other maybe unknown factor into a game into the game. So that's just an idea of like, obviously, if we think of a perfect information game like chess, indeed, there might be parts of the game where there is some memorization. For example, how your openings, the end game. But again, because the game is so deep, there's a lot of fog of war in the middle where there's still room for creativity and improvisation. Yeah,
this is quite an in-depth section because a talk that I also recommend to watch is Richard Garfield does a talk on this. Well, he does a talk on luck versus skill in games, but it also very much factors into this part of what we're discussing here, where he talks about sort of innovation versus honing. And at first, innovation being sort of the area of sort of discovering a game, and then honing is trying to master that skill. And I know this could fit into multiple sections of what we talked about, but it also links back to chess and how because it's a pure solution game, there's not much innovation to be had there, at least with the top tier players anymore. It's more about sort of honing their skill. And there's a guy, Bobby Fischer, who was a chess grandmaster. He had this idea of randomizing the setup of the backline of chess to reduce that solvability. So both players would have the same backline, but it would be randomized each game. And then that completely throws, any previous, or ideas or say the meta or strategies sort of out the window. And completely creates a new but level playing field. I don't know if it ever caught on. I only briefly looked into it really, but I thought that was quite an interesting thing that I discovered. You absolutely read my mind. I was just about to cite that Fisher example. So okay, yeah, that because that's mentioned in that Richard Garfield talk that I watched. Obviously, it's clear that having some randomness or hidden information isn't necessary to prevent solvability, because obviously there's some perfect information games that are not close to being solved. But I would say it certainly doesn't hurt. Yeah. I think a good counterexample is a game like poker, which there's a huge amount of randomness, and yet people are playing that at an extremely high level. I do think it's important. I think there's two types of randomness, and another podcast I listen to is Game Brain, and there's a guy in there called Trey who talks about this a lot. Input randomness versus output randomness. Input randomness being, say, let's just take a game, I don't know, Grand Austria Hotel. You roll the dice and you organize the dice, and it's random how the dice are rolled, but then you can now choose what to do with those dice. There's tons of games that do this. That's just the only one that's popped into my head right now. And then, you know how to deal with it. You could take poker, for example. The cards are dealt onto the table, and then the cards they're random. It's randomized, but you now can make a decision based on what's been displayed on the table. Obviously in poker, you've got the players to play against as well. And this versus output randomness, which is basically, say in any sort of, say D&D, you roll to hit. You're like, oh, I'm going to attack. You roll a dice. And then you find out if you hit or not. That you have a lot less control because it's after you've made that decision, input being before you make the decision and output being afterwards. And I think input randomness, at least for me, lends itself more to replayability because you've got more control over it.
Yeah, I think in retrospect, I think this section alone could have warranted its own episode.
Absolutely.
So we can keep moving along.
We should move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this next section was ideas of game structure, and we'll touch on a few elements of game structure, which is first, and especially in this age of crowdfunding, is do expansions add or hurt replayability? And I think in our show notes, I think we have in our own personal notes, we have both pros and cons for this. I'll put it this way. Obviously, I think provided that, for example, if there are new factions or characters, for example, in a certain type of game, provided they are well tuned and balanced, they can certainly help replayability.
Yeah.
However, for example, with hurting replayability, I think a really good example of this could be Magic the Gathering, depending on which is the entire part of that business model is that there's a constantly shifting meta, which is a certain batch of cards come out, all the players play it to death, and they immediately find which cards are dominant, which ones are useless, and then there's a meta is formed. So new cards and decks have to be constantly created to keep the game fresh and interesting.
Yeah.
So Ricky, you mentioned you could touch on this. I'll just mention the other ones quick, and then you can come back to that. Then there's what I would describe as tacked on modules or modes. So in other words, I get the sense that quite often these things are artificially added on to campaigns as a way to create stretch goals and so on. And I think the reasons these can hurt replayability are kind of along the lines of the third one, which is there's so much content in the box or so much content comes with the campaign that it just creates a lot of friction just to get the game to the table. And I would say this kind of creates what I would call the big box paradox, which is a lot of these publishers, a lot of these campaigns are creating these big boxes so that you can order everything in one box. You would think, oh, now it's all consolidated, it's all in one place. And yet I've heard several anecdotes of people who have this, and it actually makes it harder.
Absolutely.
To get the game back to the table.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned in the last episode, Le Grand, the deluxe set, which I've got. And I think I'm pretty good. I've played it a handful of times. I've been trying to explore some of the content in there, but I've only done sort of 3 or 4 modules out of, I want to say, like 12 to 14. And I don't think I'll ever get all of them played. I'd like to, but again, it does create it creates some friction just to even get those played. I think that one game that falls on maybe the both improve and hurt replayability side is another game I mentioned last week, which is Dominion, because it's a game that has fixed expansion boxes, so you can choose how much you want to expand that game. And I think if you add a few expansions, it adds more options and replayability. And I generally like to play with just a small handful, 3 or 4 expansions. But there does become a tipping point where it just becomes too much. Like you get people with Dominion sets and they store them in these massive boxes. Like, they've had to source huge boxes just to keep all the cards in there. And if I had that, I just wouldn't know where to start, even just setting the game up. So I think there is a tipping point there where more stuff can be good, in terms of more cards, for example, but then there is that tipping point where it's like, okay, this is just too much now. I can't even think about that game without getting overwhelmed.
Yeah, and I think on the contrary, or just on the other side of the equation, I think a game like Spirit Island is one that I would say unequivocally benefits from its expansion content.
Yeah.
We'll touch on that because I think the next question is, do modern games overemphasize variability? And I'll touch on the cons, and you can add in whatever nuance or flavor you want. Which obviously I think in context of these campaigns, it evokes there's more sales tactic.
Yeah.
And I also just feel like, if just allow me to be cynical for a moment, just, I think a curse or a downside of today's culturescape and social media, is that we have these short attention spans, the constant need for novelty and new dopamine hits. So we just need new stuff. I need constant novelty and variability.
Yes.
And also you get the sense that the campaigns are just trying to, as I've heard Magnus Carlsen say, squeeze water out of a rock. And again, kind of what I just mentioned previously, you get the sense that a lot of these modules are just tacked on with very little testing or tuning.
I mentioned it earlier. I think variability is often overemphasized as a marker of replayability. But I do think that for me personally, I find mastering a game to be a stronger driver. And I think that too much variability can undermine that, as I think consistency, at least some consistency between games, is essential, because you can use it as a barometer for sort of measuring how well you're doing, measuring your progress and refining your strategy. But if in every game the whole board state is completely different, the cards are completely different, when there's just each game is completely different without this level of consistency between the games, you can still enjoy the game, but I think it's hard to really gauge how well you're doing and come back to it from that angle.
Well, if that's the case, then I think you would absolutely despise Argent the Consortium, because there's again, this is also, I think, one of those games that is absolutely not a minimalist design in any sense of the word, but it's very, in terms of the board state, the board tiles, all that stuff, there's a lot of variability.
Well, I don't necessarily mind it. I just don't know if it's something that I'd want to pursue mastery of. I could still enjoy the game. I mentioned it, Le Granja. I think that's another one. The cards, there's so many cards in that deck that you can't really plan what you're going to do next game. But I still really like the game. So it's just what angle I come at it from.
Sure. So the next factor in terms of game structure is player count. Does player count affect longevity or replayability of a game? So here's just my thought on this, which is, I think it's just a point of fact that the experience of a certain game can vary wildly depending on the player count. So some games they just benefit from higher player counts, 3, 4, 5 players, where there's more interaction and competition and just makes the board tighter. If a game really only shines, here's my thought. If a game really only shines at a single player count, then in my humble opinion, I think that can actually, obviously I think there's a pro and con to that. Because obviously the game experience could be amazing, but also I think alternatively, it could damage a game's replayability because it's just implicitly harder to get it to the table. Like, for example, for a 4-player game or a 5-player game, for example, Santiago plays best of 5, maybe Brass or some games play best of 4. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's just hard to get 4 or 5 people together at the table.
Yeah.
So that can hurt replayability because you just can't get the group together.
Yeah, no, it's true. And there's games that I would like to play, but I haven't purchased or haven't pursued because I know that I won't get the player count to even really enjoy it at its best. Luckily, I play, like I said in the last episode, a lot of 2 and 3 player games. So I know that those will hit the table for me, but that's for me personally. In general, it might not work for other people that have bigger groups, for example.
So one thing you touched on in our preparation for this episode, Ricky, was this idea of minimalist design or a minimalist approach to replayability.
Yes.
So I think the way you defined this was like, or you laid this out, what's the simplest design decision that leads to lasting replay value?
Yeah.
So as soon as I saw this, it really made me think of 2 things that I've seen quite frequently on BGG. One of which was, I feel a lot of Reiner Knizia's games best exemplify this type of ethos, which is really getting the most complexity, emergent gameplay out of a small rule set. And you'll find a subset of the BGG community called they're called the OG guilds. These are the type of games they want to play. So I think the way I tried to define this using a formula, which is small rule set plus player interaction plus some strategic depth and maybe plus some randomness, I feel like gives you a somewhat minimalist approach to replayability. Now, so this is where I wanted to talk a little about Codex and why I think this type of game maybe we can talk about this minimalist idea from a different angle. So we just were talking about the Magic the Gathering model. And David Serlin, when he was designing Codex, this was his like design thesis, which was he wanted to design Codex as a contrarian design to the Magic model, which is, what if I gave you an asymmetric, fully powered deck, as in every single card in this deck can be useful or beneficial, that you could play for years without solving or getting tired of. So although there are just 6 factions available in the game, in my humble opinion, I think you could be easily entertaining for years just with the 2 factions that come in the courses. So that's what you were just talking about, Ricky.
Yeah.
Just those 2 decks. So for me, this feels like in some way, like it has like that minimalist, it still exemplifies that minimalist, because you're packing a huge punch in just one deck that you can squeeze years of gameplay out of one deck.
I agree. I think if you can get sort of that tension and that variety and that sort of strategic depth in a small package, then that's always going to be a benefit, right?
Absolutely. So we've been talking a little bit about meta, so I think we'll conclude this segment of the show talking about meta, the role of meta in game longevity and replayability. So we've heard about metas in a game community. So for example, chess in Magic the Gathering. So again, I think this is where we kind of, or even poker. I know I've heard there's metas in poker from some videos I've watched. So again, I think this is where we refer back to our pure versus mixed solution discussion, which is, so there are some games like chess or Go, pure solution games. There are just now, because there's just so many people playing them, that there are some parts of the game, like openings and endgame, that require some memorization over skill, where it's just like you just have to play it a certain. For example, in chess, if your opponent plays some type of opening, you basically need to respond some type of way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just not playing optimally. However, due to the strategic depth of some of these games, maybe there's still some parts of the game where you can exhibit some improvisation or creativity.
Yeah.
Now, there's games like poker that have hidden information, randomness, but they maybe fall on the mixed side. So they depend a lot more on reacting to your opponent. So there's like, in a game like poker, there's a meta of, oh, maybe I play against this opponent a lot in tournaments, and I know that his or her behavior, maybe they're trying to misrepresent their hand or something. So there's a meta in context of a game, and also a meta in context of how people play the game.
I do think the meta can keep these games relevant, like you say. I do think, on the other hand, there can be a level of hyper-focused gamers that some of these games can attract, that can make a game difficult for other people to get into and regularly play. Obviously, the replayability is there for the existing player base, but for new players, it can be daunting. It can be off-putting. A case in point for me is a couple of games. Terra Mystica's one that has a very, very active meta, to the point where there's factions that are, better than others. I've played a few games of Terra Mystica. I feel out of my depth, if I'm honest, when I'm playing against other players. And same with Agricola, Agricola's one that actually has a lot more variability in terms of the card decks. But again, there's such an evolving meta there that it can be hard to find players that are on your level. If you can find them, then great. I'm talking about on Board Game Arena, for example. It's hard to find players that allow me to explore the game without feeling like I'm out of my depth or being stupid with my moves.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But on the other hand, it can help with the solvability problem that we mentioned before. So, for example, taking Terra Mystica and Age of Innovation, which is kind of the re-implementation. I've not done this personally, but I know that there's a bidding system where people have, I'm not sure if this was, I think this was sort of a house rule that then became official. I'm not sure. I could be wrong there, but it led to, players, there was this bidding system where if you started with a certain faction, you would start with, less money, for example, because or you just bid on them and people knew that these were the better factions, so that it would self-balance itself. So people would spend more money to be that faction and then start with a disadvantage. The same with Tapestry. Well, not quite the same, but Tapestry being a game that had its own sort of official rebalancing update because the meta or the player base discovered that there was some major imbalances. So that's helped with some of the solvability there, I think, as well.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Terra Mystica, because that entire family of games, for example, Age of Innovation, Terra Mystica, Gaia Project, even maybe Clans of Caledonia, for some reason that game design, that game engine, it just does not click with my brain. I cannot figure out how to play that game well, or what makes that game tick. And yes, you're correct. It actually feels quite intimidating to try to join a random game on BGA, because you get the similar feeling to sitting down at a random poker table in Vegas,
yes,
and you don't know if you're just about to get eaten up by sharks,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I just finished a game of Terra Mystica and I came second, and I don't know how. I still don't feel as though I grok that game to the level that some of these other players do. And I don't mind the game, I enjoy it, but I don't think I could ever really get invested in it, because I know there's that massive sort of learning curve that I am right at the bottom of currently.
Just another example of maybe meta that I think also makes a game really enjoyable, and I just got to experience a little bit of it a few days ago when I played, I print and play. I crafted 2 characters, print and play from Yomi 2. And I finally had the opportunity. I played it a lot on Steam, but this was my first opportunity to play it in person. And what I really enjoy about that is that, number one, it uses a double blind, and then it uses a double blind card draw and a rock, paper, scissors type of system to deal with the combat. So, for example, you have attack, blocks, dodges, throws, and so on. And because it's double blind, there's this idea of trying to predict. It's a battle of wits, trying to predict and anticipate what your opponent's going to play or what they're going to do. And you start to notice patterns. And so there's also kind of this meta of how your opponent, especially if you play several matches back to back with them, you notice, in this situation, maybe they always seem to play a block or a dodge or whatever. So I think if a game has that element, it also makes it really enjoyable, and certainly I believe helps the replayability.
Yeah, that kind of leans into the sort of social element and playing the other players as well.
So I think for now, we touched on everything we wanted on this topic of longevity and replayability. Obviously, I think all the listeners could tell that we were repeatedly touching on a few games, because we feel like a lot of these games in our collections possess and exhibit a lot of these characteristics. And I think it's important that if you're keeping a small or leaner collection, that you have games that can that can tick a lot of these boxes.
Yeah, certainly. I think these are definitely the factors that really come into play for me with replayability. And I think some are more apparent than others, or more important than others for me. But I think it's interesting to really delve in and discuss these, because I think replayability is such a nebulous topic that it's kind of hard to really pinpoint what makes certain games replayable. And even just having this discussion, there's been games in my collection that I've been able to think about and really pinpoint why I do find them replayable. So it's been interesting. Yeah, no,
I feel like just preparing for this episode gave me a stronger understanding and sense of what it means at all.
Agreed.
So that brings us into our today's Wildcard segment. And Ricky, why don't you tell our listeners what today's segment is about?
So today's segment is quite simple, and it builds on what we have been discussing. And it's basically, what's your desert island game? What is the one game that you take to a desert island? Jamie, why don't you start us off?
Oh, so this one, I wrote down a few ideas, but I think going with my gut right now, and if you guys have been playing the game where you take a drink every time I mention Codex, and you're probably drunk by the end of this episode, but it would probably be Codex. Because as I mentioned, as of this month, I have played 4 or 5 back-to-back games, and I am not remotely close to being tired of it. In fact, I think I could keep doing this indefinitely and just have so much fun and enjoyment and just not get tired of it. So, and again, I want to clarify, that's playing all these games so far that I've played this month have just been one faction, and there are 5 others that I could potentially play. So I'm just having so much fun playing it. I feel we're having really interesting post-game discussions where we're kind of analyzing what we did well, where we went wrong, and I feel like I'm still not remotely close to playing it at a high level. So I find all those things really exciting, and it's funny now when I look at my collection and I see other games I haven't played in a while, I've noticed that my anxiety levels have gone down a ton because I'm just so happy playing my favorite game all the time.
That's good. Yeah, I do really need to play Codex. How did you play async again? What did you use to play async? I'll have
to show you because we can play. I can teach you how to play async sometime. It's called screentop.gg.
Okay.
In fact, there are a few Sterling games that you can play for free on screentop.gg. So it's if you are interested in giving Codex a try. Unfortunately, it's for some reason the game is out of print, and if you can find it on the secondhand market, it's outrageously expensive. I would say don't buy it.
Yeah.
You can buy the print and play files.
Okay.
On the website. So if you're motivated enough, you can, I would say, just print out like the green and red decks.
Yeah.
So that won't be as time intensive. Or if you just want to play digital, you can play for free on ScreenTop.
I'll have to try that digitally. Definitely. We'll have to do that sometime. Because it's a game that's up my alley in terms of I love that type of thing. I need to get it to the table, give it a try.
What about you, Ricky?
For me, I've been really back and forth on this, and I still don't have a definitive answer. I wish I could give 2, but that defeats the point. I think based on just the amount I've played it and the amount I still enjoy it, it would have to be Dominion.
Dominion, okay.
Yeah, it might be a really boring choice. And it's tricky because there's games that I look at on my shelf that I want to play more than Dominion, but it's about the desert island factor. You know, I've played Dominion probably close to 250 times.
Wow. Okay.
And I still get the same level of enjoyment out of it. It's not my favorite game, but it's up there. And I just think if I was to play one game, it would be that. Now, there is the sort of, you could say that's kind of cheating just by the amount of content that's available for Dominion. But I don't want to play with every expansion anyway. I've only actually played with, I want to say 4, and they're generally the beginning faction. Sorry, the first few expansions that I play with, because I find that the ones that add loads of extra components and phases in the game defeats the point. It's the purity of the game that I think I really enjoy. And I've heard, this is my opinion, obviously. I've heard some people say, oh yeah, Dominion invented deck building, or it made it popular. And I think other games have taken it to new levels since. And I disagree with that. I think the purity of Dominion is its charm. It's so distilled, and it just makes it so replayable. There's a lot of other deck builders that have extra fiddly parts, extra boards and things to keep track of, and I enjoy other deck building games, but Dominion is probably the one. Yeah, if I was to go to a desert island and play a game that I know I've already got over 200 plays of, it probably would be Dominion.
It seems like Dominion means a lot to you.
It does, and it's odd because it's not a game that I like. I only got it, I want to say 2-3 years ago, and I got it because I was going on holiday and I wanted a game that I could pack away into like a couple of small bags. And I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did. I knew about it for years, but it just, it plays really well. And it's not a game that fills me with joy just looking at the game. It's not a very pretty game. It's, the components aren't amazing, and it's not like a really personal game, but the amount of replayability I get just from the game itself, it's kind of elevated beyond that purely because of how much I've enjoyed the actual gameplay.
Hey, that's what's important. So just because I know this is a hard, for this question, this is a hard one to narrow down to one. Did you have a runner-up that you want to mention?
Yeah, I think my runner-up, I had two that I was really fighting for. I think my runner-up would be Great Western Trail, though.
Okay.
With the Rails to the North expansion. Again, not my absolute favourite game, but it's up there. And I think it's a game that I could just explore endlessly. And it's a staple in the Euro world. Pretty much anyone that likes Euro games, I know it's a popular game for Punchboard, Paradise, a lot of other podcasts. I think it's earned that spot in terms of replayability. So I think that would be my Euro choice, but it doesn't quite top Dominion, I don't think.
Yeah. I think I'm going to cheat here a little bit. I'm going to give let's just say a Euro runner-up and an abstract runner-up.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I was super torn. So obviously, I think I mentioned again earlier in this episode, probably for my Euro other modern game runner-up would be Argent.
Yeah.
Just because there's just so much content and variability that it would always be interesting and fun. For my abstract, it would be an abstract that I discovered earlier last year called Slither.
Okay.
So all you need is a Go board of any size and some stones, and you can play Slither. It's a connection game. It's essentially like playing Hex on a square grid board. And it just has this little wrinkle of after you place pieces, you can also move your pieces that are on the board. And it's such a fascinating abstract game that if I could only play that the rest of my life, I still think it would be a very fascinating, fun journey. So those are my runner-ups.
Do you know what? Abstract games have never been any games that I've got into, but not because I don't necessarily want to play them. It's just I'm never drawn to them. But I reckon there's a lot to explore there, and I could see myself getting sucked in if I was to give them a try.
There's a great website called Abstract Play that has several abstract games that I enjoy. So you can. I'm
gonna have to try that.
Yeah, you can play Slither and many others. So even if you're just interested in dipping your toes there, it's a fun place to start.
Okay.
So Ricky, I think we're already well over an hour. So I think we've had a really good discussion. Is there anything else you want to say to tie things up?
I think we discussed a lot, and to be honest, we could have talked about a lot of those factors of replayability for a lot longer, but obviously we don't want to be going for hours and hours. This might be a topic that we revisit. I think it's important that we discuss this early on, I think, because it's a big factor in terms of at least how I purchase games, because, like we said, we've only got a small space for games. So, making sure that they're ones that we can repeatedly play is important, to minimize that sort of joining and leaving the shelf process, as we try and curate games that, are lifetime style games. I'm sure it's the same for you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a really, really good discussion, and I'm sure that there'll be parts of this that we go into greater depth in future.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed our discussion today, please feel free to drop a comment or give us feedback however you want. We do have an Instagram channel at the Tabletop Minimalists, where we'll be putting up some shorts and just, links to the episodes. Feel free to interact with us there. We're still, as you may have noticed, we're still just getting started, getting ourselves established. So as our presence on Board Game Geek and elsewhere expands and gets established, we'll be sure to let you all know.
Yeah.
I think right now the publishing schedule we're trying to stick to is maybe every 2-3 weeks. Maybe we'll hone in on a fixed schedule sooner or later, but bear with us, and we hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. As Jamie mentioned, give us a follow on Instagram, the Tabletop Minimalist. I'm trying to post on there a bit more frequently over the next few weeks, so hopefully there'll be some content that resonates with you. But yeah, thanks very much for listening, and we will see you next time.
Take care, everyone.
You've been listening to the Tabletop Minimalist. If you enjoyed the show, maybe leave us a review and follow us on our Instagram at the Tabletop Minimalist. You can also drop us a line at hello@thetabletopminimalist.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time, so long and happy gaming.